Hello, everybody, and welcome to Mr. Saucedo's YouTube videos. Today, we're going to be talking about the causes of evolution. So we kind of already talked about these a little bit, but we want to make sure that we give you as much information as possible. And so we're going to talk a little bit about mutations first. So mutations are changes in genetic information, and they have to be able to be passed on to your offspring. So if you get, I don't know, let's say you grow a third arm for some reason, unless that gene or genes, I'm assuming it's a lot of genes that have been affected if you're growing a third arm. Um, but anyway, the genes that are affected are probably in your somatic cells, right? Not necessarily those germ cells. In order to get passed on to the next generation, they have to be applicable to your sperm and egg cells, right? So to those germ cells. And so mutations can definitely lead to variations. And remember, one of the very first things that Darwin saw on his trip to the Galapagos was variations. And he was thinking that is probably one of the keys to how evolution works. And so the way it works is that mutations can accumulate over long periods of time. If there are certain organisms like bacteria that can get mutations very, very quickly because they're a lot simpler. Also, they reproduce a lot more. And so the more variations that you have, the more likely your species can survive if there is an environmental disaster or an environmental change. And not all mutations are helpful. Some of them can actively hinder you. And in that situation, normally they won't get passed on, right? But it's not because, there's some greater thing out there. It's more because, well, you're probably not going to pass that on to your kids because you might die first. And so variations of a species, though, can come from other sources. It might not be mutations, because again, mutations are common, but the odds of them changing something in your DNA to something beneficial like that are going to be a little bit unlikely. But again, the more creatures, the more organisms in your population, the more likely mutations are to actually be an important part of your natural selection here. Okay, crossing over, which we talked about when we were going over meiosis, which is just the recombination during sexual reproduction, that can lead to variations. There's lateral gene transfer, which are when genes are exchanged by means other than reproduction. It happens a lot between different types of bacteria, even. Um, and that was evidenced in good old Frederick Griffin's, or Griffith, sorry, his experiment with the pneumonia causing bacteria in the rats that he was injecting. Lateral gene transfer was actually what he was seeing there. Now, gene flow is another thing. Gene flow is the transfer of genes between different populations, right? So you can say that we have like these green bugs, we have these little gold bugs, and simply by these little gold bugs or a gold bug leaving their group and going into this other bug's group, that's going to increase the variation of the receiving population. So this population that is receiving this individual is going to get some variation from that. And so isolated populations tend to evolve into different species. So gene flow could prevent this. So the fact that you now have more variation might lead to not necessarily a new species forming, but maybe just a distinct group, let's say. And so now we have, organisms that contain both alleles, or sorry, that contain both alleles for either gold or for green exoskeleton here in this situation. Genetic drift is the change in gene frequency due to chance. So again, let's say we have this huge variety of different, um, of a population. So we have this huge variety in this population. And instead, I just select like 4 at random and take them out. Okay, so what we like to call that is kind of the bottleneck effect. So the bottleneck effect is when genetic drift is occurring. So there's a change in gene frequency, but it's because of a catastrophic event. So it could be a hurricane, an earthquake, predation, overhunting. It could be a lot of things. So let's say this was our original population, but only these ones make it out. That's going to look very different than the original population, and so that could very dramatically change what these organisms gene wise develop into. The founder effect is genetic drift that happens after a small group moves to a new area. And so, birds don't carry flowers. They can carry seeds, though, right? So they can poop out seeds somewhere else. Um, I don't know why, but this bird really likes blue and yellow flowers, though. And so, again, it doesn't necessarily resemble the original population in its variation because the founders of this new little colony here were different than the original distribution of genes. And that's what genetic drift is all about. And this does tend to lead to speciation over time. Sexual selection are, traits that increase the likelihood of mating success. There are plenty of examples in Pokemon of gender variance. And so male traits tend to become exaggerated over time due to sexual selection. It's probably more common, right, in things that you've probably seen around, like peacocks. Those feathers are ridiculous and make you stick out. So why would they be like a trait to get passed on? It seems like a hindrance, but it's not. It's for mating purposes. Irish, elk deer, um, crazy huge horns that are so big that they have to rest their head against something. They can't even like move very well. Again, these traits are more often than not really not adapted for survival purposes, but instead it's attracting mates. And that's a pretty big difference because the driving force of natural selection, right, is, oh, great, like how well adapted are you? Well, remember, the other part of that isn't just how well adapted you are, it's also your ability to reproduce. So you could be the fittest, completely. But if you can't find a mate, your genes aren't going to get passed on. And that's it. So if you have any questions, please let me know.